I'm a big fan of Christmas movies, as long as they aren't festive, cheerful, or colorful. This brings us to Sundays and Cybèle, a movie that technically takes place in part on Christmas, and that I think has some holiday spirit, but that most people probably would not think of as a Christmas movie. Actually, most people would probably not think of it at all. Despite a great cast, some beautiful filmmaking, an otherworldly feel, and an uncommon story, Sundays and Cybèle isn't a very widely known movie. It came out in 1962, and it actually won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, but it was never very popular in France, where the New Wave was turning things on its head. Now, I actually think this movie is more or less at home in the New Wave, alongside movies like The 400 Blows in particular, but critics at the Cahiers du Cinema weren't favorable, and the movie never really found its place. Before long, director Serge Bourguignon would see his career sort of fizzle out. He only made 3 more movies, and this is the only one that anybody has seen, although he claims that he was offered a chance to direct The Planet of the Apes and Reflections in a Golden Eye, which I reviewed on this channel. We'll talk more about this film's legacy and Bourguignon's downfall a bit later on. Sundays and Cybèle, like I said, has a great cast. The movie follows Pierre, played by Hardy Kruger, not a native French speaker, but he seems to do pretty well here. He's a young pilot who can't remember anything about the war or anything that happened before it. There's also Cybèle, played by Patricia Gozzi, a young orphan. Patricia Gozzi also famously appeared in the film Rapture, another film that Bourguignon claims to have been offered, and another film which I reviewed on this channel when Dean Stockwell passed away, I think. Not a great review, to be honest, but that's an interesting movie. Patricia Gozzi had an electrifying career as a child actor, which is really not a phrase you hear very often. She stopped acting at the end of the decade and pursued a completely different life. She only did 2 movies after this one of them being Rapture. It's interesting that both the director and the leading actress here had such short careers. The rest of the cast is great too, not as well known, but very well chosen. This movie was shot by Henri Decaille, one of the pivotal figures in the New Wave. Decaille also filmed The 400 Blows. He worked on a bunch of Melville films like The Red Circle and Le Samurai. He also shot Alain Delon in Purple Noon, great movie, which was remade into The Talented Mr. Ripley with Matt Damon in the 90s. Wim Wenders also did an adaptation in the 70s that I'd like to watch, all based on the same book. Henri Decaille worked with Louis Malle on Elevator to the Gallows, great movie. He worked with Chabrol. He was on a lot of great movies, some very much in the New Wave frame, others not so much. This is a beautifully filmed movie in crisp, stunningly crisp black and white, at least if you get the new fancy Criterion copy of it, which looks phenomenal. It sort of has an ethereal quality to it, I think. There aren't a lot of establishing shots. It's filmed on location, outdoors and such, but a lot of these locations, they almost look like sets. They're sparse, rather than the really hectic framing of something like Breathless, which has a very dynamic camera and a bunch of things going on in the frame, almost haphazardly filmed. As Raoul Coutard, by the way, was the cinematographer there. Here we have something kind of different, something concise and compositionally exacting. It feels a little more classical. At the same time, there are a number of interesting techniques here, like quirky POV shots or some really jarring moments of modern life. For instance, the movie kicks off with a sequence showing Pierre as a pilot, but then we get an abrupt cut to a train car going by in front of Pierre after he's returned to France. The way that the train roars by feels like a war. It sounds like a war, and the light that strobes between the cars, it almost suggests gunfire. While Bourguignon might not always be on the list next to Godard and Truffaut, and while this movie does have some classic influences and classic structures, it is clearly a modern film with a logic and a pacing and a focus that is completely alien to classic cinema and a subject that would have been way out of bounds. I'll talk about the subject in a second. It's one of the most interesting things about the movie. Let me just mention that the music in this film was composed by Maurice Jarre, but it's not the typical Jarre score. It's really stripped back. That's another thing that I guess is at odds with classic Hollywood, although some of the Cahiers du Cinema may have thought this was a sentimental film. It certainly is not the classic Hollywood melodrama. Bourguignon actually claims to have introduced Maurice Jarre to Sam Spiegel who came to watch some rushes of Sundays, and Cybèle apparently having funded part of the production. And this apparently led to Jarre working on Lawrence of Arabia and launching his career outside of France. That conquered all at the Academy Awards the same year that this film did, and apparently Bourguignon returned to France with Jarre's Oscar to give it to him. Like I said, this movie takes us to a railroad platform after the opening sequence, and here we see Pierre sitting. Not clear what he's doing exactly. Doesn't seem like he's waiting for a train. A man comes up to Pierre with his daughter and asks for directions to an orphanage. Pierre follows along after they leave, and he becomes ensnared in this girl's story. Her father drops her off and he says he'll be back on Sunday, but Pierre comes to learn that he has no plans to return. And it ends up being Pierre who comes back to visit on Sundays, and the rest is history. The setup is just about plausible. It is a bit mechanical. It feels a little bit classical. Bit different from later parts of the movie. The setup is a little bit more mechanical. As we go on, it becomes more and more clear that something is up with Pierre. He has lost his memory, but he also struggles to find his way in the present to obstruct himself. Pierre is overseen by a woman named Madeleine, who seems to be his girlfriend or nurse, and who seems totally devoted to him, committed to his recovery, ready to shoulder a huge emotional burden, and busy on Sundays, at least until the end of the year. Pierre doesn't tell her about is this girl that he's creating some kind of relationship with. Pierre doesn't really seem to remember who Madeleine is. He isn't enchanted with her as much as with this girl from the orphanage. She's 12, by the way. But Pierre himself also seems in some ways to be a child. So are these two friends, lovers, father and daughter, or mother and son? Well, I think part of the movie is seeing how this relationship is balanced. The movie does tip its hand at the end, and for some viewers, it might be easy to forget that it's far from obvious how this will turn out. A lot of very positive reviews really embrace one aspect of this story, but I think it would be somewhat naive not to realize that a big part of the dramatic engine of the film, particularly in the early sections, is seeing how the relationship evolves. I'm not going to spoil things. I think this relationship does make the movie somewhat challenging, but mainly in a good way, because it brings us to foreign dramatic territory, a place where we aren't really sure what we're pulling for. I think this aspect of the film, as well as the somewhat ethereal style and the magnetism of the actors, really enthralls the right sort of viewer. It makes this feel like a movie that is totally out of time, a movie from another planet. That said, some of these elements are really not so alien. There are a lot of New Wave films that build foundations on uncertain moral ground, rejecting the didactics of traditional Hollywood. That's kind of the hallmark of the time. The 400 Blows is a good example, where we empathize with Antoine Doinel. Poor kid, but also he keeps making bad decisions that can be kind of infuriating. Pierre pulls some of the same moves from time to time, and the movie is in some ways built on the same unsound moral foundations. It's interesting that both these movies focus on kids, in some ways inventing children as a new type of cinematic entity, not part of a family, and not just a stand-in for morality in general, but as their own puzzling sort of people. In the liminal space of a kid's brain, there is something deeper about how we have emerged into adulthood, or something like that. Interesting. Not a character you would have found necessarily in earlier movies. When Pierre and Cybèle start spending Sundays together, the movie really slows down. It throws most of the classical hooks out the window and takes us to a lake to stare at reflections on the water. There's a nice moment when a small remote-controlled destroyer transits the lake, some kind of reminder of war. There's a lot of interesting little things in this movie. We see Pierre working for a local artist to build an aviary, for instance. This is an interesting contrast to his career as a pilot. There's a lot of discussion of trees in the movie. Actually, things are pretty elemental. We have water, ice, fire, earth, trees, sky, etc., playing a big part in this section of the film. There's a certain mysticism and a certain poetry that I think, again, is extremely enthralling. a lot of fun little moments, like when Cybèle encounters a painter who is painting a tree along the lake, and she scolds her because he's painting her tree. She's taking it away from her. The sort of childish possessiveness that she also seems to feel towards Pierre, but that also coexists with some moments of real wisdom and a certain type of attachment. Being attached to a tree in that way is endearing, but also maybe profoundly comforting. Another interesting piece is that Cybèle hides her name from Pierre. The nuns at this orphanage make her change it because it isn't Christian. Of course, being forced to change your name is a good way to lose your identity and your agency. And in withholding her name, I guess Cybèle gets some of her agency back. Of course, the audience knows Cybèle's name all along because it's in the title of the movie, at least in the English title. The French title doesn't have her name in it. The Japanese title only has her name in it. It was called Cybèle in Japan, where the movie was apparently a huge hit. Knowing Cybèle's name is a bit of dramatic irony, I guess, another way in which the audience is a step ahead of the somewhat childish Pierre. There's still a little bit of traditional framing here, mainly in the question of whether they will be caught. Pierre doesn't tell Madeleine about Cybèle. Madeleine is off at work in Paris. She's a nurse. But as Pierre and Cybèle sort of frolic around the lake, they leave some suspicious looks in their wake. And it seems like maybe just a matter of time before things collide, before someone in the village tells Madeleine, before the rumors come full circle. I said before that Madeleine's Sunday shifts, they aren't permanent. So what's going to happen when she comes back? And even if you view this relationship as wholesome, what is Pierre doing to Madeleine, someone who cares deeply for him, but for whom he doesn't seem to feel much? In many ways, Pierre and Cybèle both are trying to avoid the inevitable in this movie. Cybèle has been abandoned and faces a life alone, faces adulthood. I guess she's trying to hold on to a last shred of innocence, of childhood. Pierre faces his own past. Maybe it's just as inevitable. Can he hide from that forever? I think this holding on to this feeling of holding on to the last dregs of something so pure is another thing that resonates with people in this movie. Purity is a big idea in the film. What's the opposite of purity? Abandonment and war, I guess. Those are cynical things. This movie teases out cynicism. It teases out the cynicism that steers most people every day, whether that's cynicism towards a fortune teller, cynicism towards Pierre and Cybèle, cynicism towards Madeleine for how much she cares, cynicism for a certain wholesome cause. There's an interesting wedding dinner in this scene that's surprisingly cruel at a wedding, cruelness at a wedding. Madeleine is really an unsung hero of this film. It's clear from very early on that she takes on a huge amount of emotional labor in caring for Pierre. I don't want to spoil things, but as things go on, there are a number of times where you think that Madeleine is going to jump to a conclusion, but actually she takes her time to think and to see, and she does something wise. Well, except for one crucial mistake. I've long said that uncertainty is one of my favorite things in this film, and you can really see that in Madeleine. There's a lot of uncertainty in film. Uncertainty and cynicism are kind of related too, I think. Maybe cynicism is a sort of false certainty. Like I said in the beginning, it's interesting that this movie about things that can't last was made by a director with a very short career and starred an actress with a very short career. It's probably coincidence, but these kinds of stories, the story of a short career, of things that could have been, story of a child star, story of temporary beauty, are another thing that might resonate with this movie. Why didn't Bourguignon make another big hit? He claims that Truffaut and Godard were jealous of his Oscar success and sabotaged the critical reception of the film in France. I think it's possible that Bourguignon himself wasn't that easy to work with. He and Patricia Gozzi both may have been a bit hard-headed. This movie does in some ways feel like an outlier in cinematic history, and I think that's one thing that makes it so appealing, but it's not really that out of place in the new wave, like I've said. The style is a little bit different. The style is a little bit more restrained. It's not as hectic. In the avant-garde, tiny differences in context, tiny differences in vibe can make a huge difference in how something is received. The characters at the bleeding edge are usually a bit incendiary, and I can definitely picture Godard and co. dismissing this movie for being, I guess, too sentimental or too classical, artificial in some way, not enough street scenes, or maybe just having too many birds in it. I can also picture a mainstream audience struggling with the main relationship in this film, and that could be a problem today as well. But if you don't find yourself in either of these two categories, I think you're in for a treat with Sundays and Cybèle. It's not the only movie with this kind of relationship. Of course, there's Taxi Driver, Leon the Professional, Tiger Bay. That's a great movie, one of Haley Mills' early films. But this movie comes together in a special way, and thank goodness there's a nice remastered version you can watch today, and this movie is getting a little bit more traction than it has had at certain points, because it is really, I think, a beautiful outlier in cinematic history.